We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. We're getting very close to the end here, and the Apostle Paul's in the middle of a presentation about his own credentials that obviously, he's even going to use the phrase, "you drove me to it." So it's obviously one of these things that he didn't want to do, and it makes me think of experience that happened to me, and I'm ashamed to tell you, but I'm going to tell you anyway because it fits so perfectly here. I had the opportunity to introduce a preacher, a guy who, his name's Ben Merritt. If you want to know something about this guy, my dad knows him a whole lot better than I do. But this man, from everything I know, just a real servant of God. And the earliest I know him, of him, would be when he was preaching in southern Indiana. Was it Sullivan? Is that right? In southern Indiana, he served a church, and it was one of these things where it just had explosive growth. It was just, and this guy's a good preacher, and he did a very good and effective job. Well, I don't know all the details of this other than the fact that he was there for several years, and the church grew tremendously, and a lot of different churches and places would have him, invite him to come speak, and so he traveled quite around quite a bit, and was always appreciated to listen to this guy speak. Anyway, long story short, he ends up going from Sullivan, Indiana, out to Los Angeles, and in Los Angeles, he takes a very small congregation. He may have started it, but I think they were already there ahead of time. But it's a very small congregation. The problem, and they grew, explosive growth there too. But the problem in Los Angeles is the price of land. You know, it's just real expensive up there. And so they ended up, this church that he served out there, he was preaching 5 times Sunday morning, 5 consecutive services. And we're not just talking about 5 services. The services, they would also broadcast to other buildings. So you get the flavor of this guy being very good. So he hits 65 and decides to retire. And so he retires and he goes to this little church in Missouri, St. Charles, Missouri. It's on that's the northwest side of St. Louis. Anyway, St. Charles area, little church there. He's there for about 15 years, and it grows explosively. It's in the thousands, right? And here he's in his retirement. This is a retirement church. Every place he's gone. So he's in his 80s now, and he's speaking to a group, and the purpose of him speaking to this group is to talk about different strategies and things like that. He did a little bit of preaching, a little bit of teaching, got into the Word a little bit, but it was mainly talking about things that happen in church, and it was mainly a gathering of church leaders, right? Well, I had the opportunity to introduce him on that occasion. One other thing, I'm sorry to make this so long, but one other thing that's pertinent to what happened. Through the years, and again, I always like to listen to him. I'd go to several different places where he'd be preaching at a convention or something like that. Always loved to go to his seminars and stuff like that. And I noticed something through the years. After he preached a sermon, I would love to talk to him. And I'd go up to him and I'd say, Brother Merritt, really appreciated that. And if you said anything in any way of a compliment, it's like he hated it. He just couldn't take a compliment. He would put his head down and you know, like he wants to change the subject or go someplace else. And the reason I noticed that is not because it was really weird, you know, when you try to compliment somebody, but some of my buddies said, "Have you ever noticed that about Ben Merritt? Have you ever tried to compliment him?" Like, yeah, I've noticed that about him. So that's the backdrop to me introducing him when he's like 80 years old, speaking about church stuff. So I'm thinking, I'm just making a big excuse because I did wrong. I'm thinking, I don't want to embarrass the guy. So I gave him a very brief introduction. I said, this is a man who needs no introduction. You know? And I said a few words. He gets up. In the first 5 minutes of his presentation, you see his face, it's kind of red. You know he's just hating this. But the first 5 minutes, he keeps talking about Professor Ellis. What's Ellis's first name? It used to be Joe Ellis. He says, Joe Ellis is always telling me, you've got to tell him your credentials. You've got to tell him your credentials. So he started talking about Sullivan, Indiana. And he's shaking his head. You can tell he's just embarrassed. And he said, but you got to tell him your credentials. And then he went ahead and told him about what happened at Los Angeles. And he says, but you got to tell him your credentials. And he went ahead and told him about when he retired at St. Charles. And the whole time it's like, that's what I should have done. I was the guy who introduced him. I should have told everybody that stuff. But that's what comes to mind with this passage. The Apostle Paul is saying something that he shouldn't have to say. This is something he should have known, especially if he ministered with them. He did. He's part of the team who started the church there. They knew better. And I don't know, I don't want to overread this, but I can just see him, like Ben Merrill, kind of like, didn't want to say this, don't want to have to go there. But you know what? You're driving me to it, and you need to know this. Wow. I'm glad this happened. I'm glad God, through His providence, had this recorded for us, because what he talks about as these are his credentials, I'm afraid people today wouldn't point to these same kind of things. You're going to see a list that's mainly sufferings and hardships. Isn't that great? I think there's a lot of implications of this. He's been building up to this for a long time, but we're finally to this, right? Verses 16 through 21 is where we left off last week, and we get a little bit of a flavor of these guys who are critical of the Apostle Paul. And from what we can tell to this point, remember, they're comparing him, that these guys are comparing him to the other apostles. So they're saying negative things about him, such as he's bold and powerful in his letters, but you know what, face to face, you don't have to worry about Paul. Right? And they're saying derogatory things like he's not equal with the other apostles. But one other thing we find out in these verses, look back up at verse 20. In fact, you even put up with someone who enslaves you or exploits you or takes advantage of you or pushes himself forward and slaps you in the face. And he says, verse 21, to my shame, I admit I was too weak for that. Okay, this is against the backdrop of these kind of people who seem to me, this seems to be a classic example of lording it over, of being kind of brutal with people. And he's saying, no, I cared for you. But look at when he gets into talking about himself. The rest of verse 21. What anyone else dares to boast about, I'm speaking as a fool. Notice these little parenthetical statements here. It's kind of like, I didn't want to have to go here. This is foolishness, but I'm going to do it anyway. I also dared to boast about. Okay, you want to talk about some of these things these guys bring up? Let's go ahead and do that. Verse 22. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Okay, isn't that a little redundant? What's the difference between a Hebrew and an Israelite? Probably is a little bit of difference. What distinction do you think he's making here?
Speaks.
Say what?
He speaks the Hebrew language.
Yes. And isn't that interesting? If you're an Israelite, Hebrew, don't you think you would speak Hebrew? What did most people speak in the first century in Jesus' time? Aramaic, which is closely related to Hebrew, but it's not. It's different. What was the national, I didn't mean to say national, international language of the first century?
Greek.
It was Greek. Okay. What's a subset of Greek? What kind of Greek was the New Testament written in? Yeah, what's the difference between Koine and classical Greek? What does Koine mean?
Common language.
Yeah, it's the common language. In fact, it wasn't up till about 150 years ago or so that scholars figured this out. In fact, some of the real old stuff, they used to call it Holy Spirit Greek because it's not like classical Greek, and they couldn't quite figure it out. You know how they figured this out? Through going through a garbage dump in Egypt, Alexandrian area, they found shopping lists written in Greek. And guess what? Hey, this is the Greek of the New Testament. So instead of this being some Holy Spirit Greek, oh no, Koine just meant it was the common everyday language. I digress. Let's go back to this. He's just saying, I'm not just an Israelite. I'm one who speaks Hebrew. So probably distinguishing himself from those who in the dispersion as far as being in other places. He says, are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Took great pride in being Abraham's descendants. Are they servants of Christ? I'm out of my mind to talk like this. I am more. Okay, they might be making a claim, but the Apostle Paul wants to, he's not just saying, hey, they're Jews, I'm Jews. They speak Hebrew, I speak Hebrew. No, I think at this point, if I'm reading this correctly, he's going to go a little bit further. He's going to call into question, are they really serving Christ? I hope we see that in the upcoming verses. Anyway, he says, I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently. Okay, here's where we go. It's not just the hard work. He's been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. Do you remember the significance of that? Why minus 1?
40 of killing.
Well, no. I'm glad we brought this up. Yeah, there was the original intent that you wanted to limit the lashes to 40 because you could kill people, right? But why would they do 40 minus? Why would they only do 39 lashes?
They went over
Wanted to be right to the head.
So they what?
Be sure they didn't miscount.
To be sure they didn't miscount. Why is that such a big thing?
They can get it themselves.
Say what?
It would be turned around, and the person being beaten could be the one that beat.
That's exactly right. Just like the Roman soldiers, if you lost a prisoner that you were taking, what was the penalty for you?
Death.
Yeah, it was your life. So that really motivated you to be a good guard, right? Well, in this 40 lashes, the practice was if you went too far, then you got beaten. So that's why let's just stop at 39, just to be safe. That was just common practice with the lashes. Okay, but in addition to the 40 lashes minus 1, he says in verse 25, 3 times beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. By the way, I don't know if you remember this or not, but back when we were talking about how much time difference is there between the writing of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians? Do you remember this? Yeah, a matter of months, probably within the year. So there's not much time there, and the best dates, and there's a lot of evidence for this, the dates that we put on this. What we're going to see in this list, like in Acts, the 27th chapter, where the shipwreck, where he's in the open sea and things like that, hasn't happened yet. So some of this stuff on here that he's listing, and you're thinking to yourself, oh yeah, well I remember some of this stuff that I read in the book of Acts. Well, sometimes, depending on when that happened, if it would be in the first missionary journey, well then yes. But if it's after his visit to Corinth, or later on in the book of Acts, in other words, I'm trying to say all the things he lists here, there's a whole lot more that happens to the Apostle Paul. Okay? Let me see. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. By the way, at the end of the first missionary journey and the second missionary journey, they go back and visit the churches again. But at the very end, that would be Lystra and Derbe. What happened to them at Lystra and Derbe? That's where the stoning, one of the stonings that we know about, probably the reference here, that'd be in Acts, the 14th chapter. I spent a night and a day at the open sea, and by the way, this cannot be referring, if we've got our dates right, to the shipwreck experience in Acts chapter 27. So there's more to it than that. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen. You'd like to think that, you're in a foreign country, you're traveling someplace. Maybe my view on this is a little bit skewed because almost every time I've been out of the country, it's been on a missions trip, which means usually a third world country are not a real nice place. And maybe this is just the fact that I'm a wimp, but I can remember standing in the airport at, what is it, Port-au-Prince? Is that the capital of Haiti? I felt so white, so white. I'm standing there and all these foreign people, and I also felt like, oh, I wish I could find an American. That would be so nice. I didn't find an American. There were 2 Haitian guys who came up to me, spoke English well, and they were Christians, and I felt like better than Americans. I felt like I had some Christian brothers. But sometimes when you're out of your own country, you expect just a certain amount from other people who are from your country. But the Apostle Paul had the exact opposite, especially on his missionary journeys. Every place he would go, there were a group of Judaizers, people who thought that Paul was misrepresenting God's truth, They were teaching that you had to become Jews first before you could become Christians, along with that circumcision, the sign of the Jewish covenant. And so they would dog his path. And worse than that, and again, this happens later on, but you remember when the Apostle Paul comes back to Jerusalem? Remember Agabus and the churches, the Holy Spirit's telling him what's going to happen to him, right? What's going to happen to him if he goes back to Jerusalem?
He's bound.
He's going to end up in chains. So what does Paul do? Goes back to Jerusalem anyway. Well, look at this list.
He's breaking his heart.
You know, being in chains, that's probably like, so that happens to me every week, right? Well, anyway, when he goes back to Jerusalem, you remember that whole thing in the temple courtyards. He's falsely charged. What's the false charge? The false charge is that he brought a Gentile into the court area where he's not allowed to. Of course, he didn't do that. And remember, he stood up, and by the way, this gets back to the languages. Why did the Roman guard allow him to speak? Because he spoke to them in Greek. Then when he turns to the audience, what does he do? Speaks to them in Aramaic, right? And so anyway, they're happy to listen to him until he starts talking about Gentiles, right? As is often the case. Anyway, remember that whole story? After he's in prison, Paul has to, remember, he doesn't get the fair hearing in front of the Sanhedrin. Remember that? And he can quickly tell that, you know what, I'm not going to get a fair hearing here. So what does he bring up?
The fact that he's a
I'm a prisoner here because of what?
gospel.
Because I believe in the resurrection. Now, why would he bring that up?
Sharp division on that.
Why would you bring something up like that in court? Why would you do that? Because you know half the judges agree with you and half the judges don't agree with you, right? And if you want the judges to argue amongst themselves, and that's exactly what happened. Big dispute. Anyway, he has to appeal to Caesar. He's eventually going to make it to Rome. But while he's in prison, do you remember what 40 Jewish men do?
Take a vow.
They take a vow. What's the vow?
To kill him.
Kill him.
We're not going to eat again until we kill that guy.
So what happened to those 40 men?
He must have
Starved
starved
to
to
death.
No.
Okay, speak a little bit louder. What did I
He
miss?
must have
I
starved to
said,
death.
what happened to those 40 men?
Either they didn't keep their vow,
Or they died before he did.
yeah, we didn't get the rest of that story. Remember, what is it, his nephew?
Nephew, yeah.
Was it his nephew who goes ahead? I'm going off script here. Anyway, there are so many stories like that in the New Testament of the Apostle Paul and what he has to experience, right? Which verse did we leave off? Oh, yeah, dangers from my own countrymen. He says here, where is that? The middle of verse 26. Dangers from Gentiles. Can you think of some of the missionary journeys where he had trouble with the Gentiles? Maybe some tradesmen who were going to lose some money. Where was that?
Ephesus.
Yeah, at Ephesus, the silversmiths there. How about Philippi? It's pretty safe to say that it was a Gentile influence because what we know of Philippi is almost no Jewish influence. How do we know there's almost no Jewish influence in Philippi? Didn't have a synagogue. So if you don't have what do you have to have a synagogue?
10 Jewish families.
Yeah, 10 heads of family. And so you didn't have 10 Jewish families. And Philippi's huge at this time. But you don't have that much Jewish influence. So where did he go? Because this is where the Jews would meet if there wasn't a synagogue. Go down by the river. Go down and who does he find there?
Lydia.
Okay, again, I don't want to read too much into this, but if you find Lydia there, what's that hinting at? Maybe we don't have one male leadership. Maybe so, but Lydia's obviously there, and he meets her at Philippi. Nonetheless, did he run into trouble at Philippi? Yeah, there are three main events that take place at Philippi. The last one takes place in prison with the earthquake at Philippi. So, in trouble from his own countrymen, in trouble from the Gentiles as well. We're going to get into a more specific example of that at Damascus. Why does Damascus hold a special spot in Paul's life? What happened on the way to Damascus?
When he was knocked off his horse.
Yeah, the conversion experience, right? The bright light. He's knocked. Jesus speaks to him on the way to Damascus.
The risen Jesus.
Yes, why do you, Saul, why do you persecute me? That whole event took place. As soon as he makes it to Damascus and he realizes that he was wrong, what does he start doing? He starts reasoning with everybody else. You need to turn to Jesus too. The Apostle Paul's not the kind of guy who, okay, I was wrong, I'm just going to go away. No. If this is right, then instead of being 100% against it, I'm going to be 100% for it. And so he throws all the Jewish people into confusion in Damascus. So at the very first place Paul goes, after this experience on the road, there in Damascus, very first thing that happens is he's in trouble from the Jews, and he's also in trouble from the Gentiles, from the get-go. We'll see that in a minute if we have time. Anyway, dangers in the city, dangers in the country, dangers at sea, dangers from false brothers. I'd submit that's what's happening here with the church at Corinth as well, but it happens several times throughout his ministry. I have labored and toiled, I have gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak and I do not feel it? I do not feel weak. Who is led into sin and I do not inwardly burn. Okay, I've got a question for you, and you'll probably see right through this. Doesn't Jesus say we're not supposed to worry? Yeah, he says we're not supposed to worry. He goes into great detail. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you, so don't worry about stuff. Is Paul worrying here? No. Yeah, okay, tell me the difference.
He's zealous for their growth.
He is jealous for their growth, and I'll admit that. But look at these terms here. Who is it? Who is weak and I do not feel weak? Who is led in sin and I don't inwardly burn? Look at the end of verse 28. The pressure of concern for all the churches. Go back to chapter 7 for just a minute here. 2 Corinthians chapter 7. Look at verse 5. When we came to Macedonia, which, by the way, he's traveling down towards Achaia, where Corinth is. But on the way there, he says, when we came to Macedonia, this body of ours had no rest. We are harassed at every turn. Conflicts on the outside. What within?
Fear.
Fears within. What I'm trying to do is, what I want us to think about is, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but I'm wondering sometimes if we don't confuse, if we don't make a good distinction between concern and worry. Obviously, the Apostle Paul's concerned. How concerned is he? He can't sleep. How concerned is he? It bothers his stomach. Who hurts? Who inwardly burn? Isn't that talking about bothering him to a physical level? Is that worrying? No. That's concern. What's the difference between concern, godly kind of concern, but concern and worry? I'm sorry, but I want to belabor this just a minute because I think we get tripped up on this all the time. Worrying is a sin. We're not supposed to do that. This is not, or maybe you disagree with me. Does anybody think the Apostle Paul's sinning here?
I'm just thinking in 1 Corinthians 12, it talks about the body, and if one part suffers, they all suffer. It kind of implies that there's some mutual pain. And so I don't think that could be worrying.
Yeah, and that's actually an endorsement of the way the body is supposed to function. They're supposed to be feeling for one another. And rejoicing with those who rejoice, same passage there. But hurting with those who hurt, there ought to be that kind of compassion and that kind of concern. I think we're not. I think that's a lack of the kind of Christian love we're supposed to have if we don't have that kind of feeling. Well, where do you cross over the line into worry? What makes worry worry? Am I asking this right, or am I not asking this right? What makes worry worry?
You lose hope.
Have we talked about this before? You know the word translated worry, you know what it literally means? It literally, I love this. I love these word pictures that sometimes you get. The word worry literally means pulled apart. Pulled apart. Can you picture somebody on a fence, and they're being tugged this direction, somebody's got this arm, and they're being tugged this direction, somebody's got this arm, they're pulling them this direction and that direction. And it's as though, maybe this terminology would work better, toiling over, I don't know what I should do. Should I do this? Should I do that? Oh, I don't know. You know, to the point where you feel like you're pulled apart. I would submit that's not going on with the Apostle Paul at all. There's no questioning here what should happen, what God wants, what God's will is. It's not a matter of indecisiveness, right? Being pulled one way or the other. He knows their relationship with God is the most important thing. But when you're paralyzed, when you're frozen with fear, that's worry. That's worry. The Apostle Paul can still have feelings, but he's not worried. He's not worried that oh no, is God going to let him down? Of course not. What concerns him though? It's going to be hard for them. It's going to hurt him. And is he concerned that they're not growing the way they're? Sure he is. I think that's part of the sleeplessness there. I don't know if I'm drawing a very good line here or not, but Christians are concerned, but we never lack confidence in the will of God or what God says. We know that. When you get to the point where you start questioning stuff like that, you've crossed over the line from concern to worry. Does that make sense?
I'm curious. The couple of passages that come to mind were, of course, Jesus talking about food and clothing and stuff.
Yes,
and
yes,
then the other
yes.
one about not being anxious, but prayer, not in Philippians. Is it safe to say that a lot of what worry is when we doubt that God's going to do what he promised he's going to do?
Calling into question, yes. Yeah. Oh, I think that'd be great because that passage, the Matthew 6 passage about the food and the clothing and things like that, leads up to that classic verse in 33. It's about seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Keep focused on what God wants. Don't get distracted. Don't get pulled by these other things and let it stop you from doing the very things that God wants you to do. At one level I'm sure we get this, but isn't that a classic example of what happens to God's people so many times?
I think you made a great point about not being paralyzed with fear, because Paul talked about it in his death. He was saying he was torn between going to be with the Lord,
Yes.
or staying to work.
For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. Yeah,
right?
yeah, good.
So he was torn, but he wasn't torn to the point of paralyzed with indecision.
Yeah,
He
if
was still
I'm
gonna
alive, I know exactly what I'm going to do.
Right.
Apostle Paul, if I'm in prison, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I got a guy chained here, got a guy chained here. He also tells the church of Philippi, you know what's happened as a result of my chains? The whole Praetorian Guard knows about Jesus now. It's kind of like, that's fine, it's another opportunity. Okay, maybe, we'll get into this a little bit. Well, no, let's sorry. A passage like this makes me want to really bring up the health wealth gospel. You guys know what I'm talking about with the health wealth gospel. Whether you know by that terminology or not,
Don't preach here. We'd be
a good deal of what you will see if you turn on TV and you go to religious channels will be what some of us call health wealth gospel. And some of their favorite phrases is God wants to prosper you. You know what? Properly understood, I don't have a problem with that phrase. But most of the time I hear that phrase, I've got a problem with that phrase. Because I'm thinking, most Americans think, that means healthy, wealthy, wise, right? A little bit more money, God answers my prayers. Okay, here's the Apostle Paul making an argument for he's the real deal. This is a classic example of what a Christian's like. Does that look like health, wealth gospel to you? Do you understand what I'm asking? 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, anybody who desires to live a godly life will be
In Christ.
will be persecuted. He warns Timothy. That's part of it, part and parcel of it. Okay, a couple other questions just to stimulate thought, I hope, or just to plant a seed. What does this say about miraculous abilities? Did the Apostle Paul have miraculous abilities?
Yes.
Was he able to heal the sick?
Yeah.
Was he able to change things? Oh my, so many examples of miraculous ability. Why didn't, presto magico, chains fall off? Well, that happened once, not as a result of his miraculous ability he had, but as a result of, which by the way, when did that happen? When did the chains fall off the Apostle Paul?
In prison.
It happened at Philippi. Where was he?
In prison.
Sitting in jail cell. What was he doing?
Praising God.
Praising God, singing hymns, praising God, right? Well, in all likelihood, if God didn't intervene, what was going to happen first thing in the morning?
Execution.
Probably death. And the Apostle Paul, same attitude like Church of Philippi, the first chapter. You know what? To live means I'm serving Christ. To die? Yes! So he was probably, this is the day I've been looking forward to, whatever hymn that is. Whatever, right? But in that kind of attitude, the chains fall. He wasn't, I don't mean to make fun of this or overstate it in any way, but let me go ahead and do this anyway. He wasn't, oh God, please get me out of this mess. I don't know what I'm going to do. You know, could you please make these chains fall off? That's not the indication we have at all. It was, you know what? If God sets him free, that's fine. And he's going to serve God. But if it's time for him to die, that's fine too. But the miraculous, we're going to get into the very next chapter, and the Apostle Paul is going to talk about a physical, he's going to talk about a thorn in the flesh, right? If he has the power to heal people, could the Apostle Paul have healed himself?
Probably not.
I'm going to say yes. Would he have?
No.
And obviously he didn't. It's not the purpose of miracles. What is the main purpose of miraculous power as far as what the Bible talks about with miracles?
Further the gospel.
To bring God glory.
Okay,
You're a
it
testament.
does bring God's glory, and it does further the gospel specifically by,
A testament.
here are the references, John chapter 5, verse 36, John chapter 10, verse 37, 38, and Acts chapter 2, verse 22. All those passages, remember Jesus says in the Gospel of John, you don't believe in me? Believe in the miracles. Why? Because the miracles prove me. They're credentials, they're proof, they're evidence. He was attested to you. How? Through these signs and wonders, through these miracles. So they are not, you know, I don't know if I'm disagreeing with anybody here or not, but I think this is a classic example. This is a classic passage, especially with Paul's thorn in the flesh. Some people think Jesus wants all sick people to be healed. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. I think he wants an ultimate, eternal healing for people. And sometimes that means not being healed in this life, as far as physically goes. I think this is a great example of that. That's not the purpose of the miracles that were performed. And to me, this backdrop of what's going on here, Paul's whole life, it's kind of like a lot of people would say, did you have a successful ministry? Paul says, here's my evidence of a successful ministry. Most of us would say, really? You know, show me the thousands of people. Show me the big paycheck. Show me how many people turned out and stuff like that. And Jesus, the most successful, without a doubt, Christianity is based on Jesus. He is the most successful at doing Christianity. And he will take a crowd, over 5,000 men, and he'll whittle them down to just his disciples. And he'll turn to them and say, do you want to lead me too? On occasion, he's happy to give up the numbers. It's just sometimes we have a skewed view of what success means. And I just think this is a classic example to talk about that because of what the Apostle Paul is saying here. Verse 30, if I must boast, I will of the things that show my weakness. There's a strategy to this. He's going to carry this thought on through. I'll boast about the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, who is to be praised forever, knows that I am not lying. In Damascus, the governor under King Aretas, in the city of the people of Damascus, sorry, he ordered a guard to arrest me. Verse 33, but I was lowered in a basket from the window in the wall and slipped away through his hands. Now, if you read this over in Acts, the 9th chapter, it doesn't mention the governor of the king, the governor of the king, or the Gentile side. It just mentions the Jewish side. But obviously, we've got both Jews and Gentiles. Luke tells us in the book of Acts that the Jews were part of this, and Paul mentions there's also the Gentile aspect. Why bring this up at the end of the list? Because remember what Damascus is where it all starts. So it's as though he says, you know, my life from day one, this is just the way it's been. But this is an example of, this is a sign of somebody who's truly an apostle of God, and these are his credentials. Must I go on boasting, although there is nothing to be gained? I will go on to visions and revelation. Is there a difference between a vision and a revelation? For the apostle, if we're talking about visions from God, every vision would be a revelation, but not every revelation is necessarily a vision. God can reveal himself in different ways. Okay, I will go on and talk about visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether he's in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Okay, please don't be confused by this. And again, if you take exception with this, I'm glad to hear what your view is on this. I know the Apostle Paul is talking about, I know a man. I'm convinced he's talking about himself. You know how sometimes people will, in the third person, say, well, there's this guy. Really, he's talking about himself. Why is Paul doing that? Again, I just have visions of guys like Ben Merrill that's kind of like getting red in the face. I really don't want to talk about this. But you know what? Let me put this out there. Let me tell you why we're going to hear this. He's talking about this man. But let me tell you why I'm personally convinced he's talking about himself. Skip on down to verse 7 for just a minute. We're going to come back up and read the intervening verses. But down to verse 7, it says, to keep me from becoming conceited because of what?
Surpassing greatness.
Yeah, my translation says because of these surpassing great revelations. Okay, in other words, the reference is because of things like this that I just talked about. In other words, I am talking about me. Does that make sense? Let's go back up and fill in the blanks here. He says, I know a man in Christ 14 years ago was caught up. By the way, what's the significance of 14 years ago? That puts this before Lystra and Derbe. This can't be talking about him being stoned at Derbe. Which, by the way, I know you don't care, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I think he died at Lystra and Derbe. In my theory, just my opinion, well, what happens when you get stoned?
Usually die.
You usually die, yes. There's good reason
Don't
for
want to
that.
be in stone.
It's kind of like, what usually happens to you when an elephant falls on you? You know what I mean? But the thing that's so amazing to me is after he was stoned at Lystra and Derbe, do you remember what the Bible says? Got up and went back into the city. So it's not he was lifted up or he was gurneyed back into the city. So I really do think there was a miracle that takes place there. But I just mentioned that to say that's not what this is talking about. This puts this before that. Okay, so this is another occasion. And he says he was caught up in the third heaven, whether he is in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Okay, I want to make a distinction here. There's some question marks around this, and Paul's very upfront about the fact that I really don't know exactly what happened, but it's not the fact. The fact that it happened is without question, but the details of what it was that happened, that's what he puts a question mark on. Was he really in his body or out of it? A lot of people would look at a passage like this and say this is a classic example of, what do you call them, out-of-body experiences or life after life, or you've heard experiences like this? Okay, I think there's a great word of caution for all those kind of experiences, and I personally think we find it right here. He says in verse 3, and I know that this man, whether he's in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise. He heard inexpressible things, things that a man is not permitted to tell. Paul probably could have gone into a lot of detail. He could have probably written a book called Heaven is Real and all sorts of stuff. But sorry, you caught that.
Yeah.
he didn't. I think there's a lot of evidence that points to the fact that there's more than just a physical existence by the fact that so many people report that they have these life after life experiences. I also think it's extremely dangerous to base any theology on that. We base our theology on what God has clearly said here. And it just bothers me. Back when this stuff, I don't know about you guys, you probably know a lot more about this than I do, but back in the 80s, it's the first time I remember, no, that's not true. Back in the 70s, I remember there were some studies done and people started talking about these life after life experiences. But in the 80s, there was a book written by a cardiologist who became a Christian, by the way, and it was called Beyond Death's Door. And the reason he wrote this book, and by the way, I really don't want to get into this, I just want to make this one statement. And if you want to get into this, maybe after class. Beyond Death's Door, the point he made was, at that time when people were talking about this, everybody was talking about the bright light. Everybody was talking about how wonderful it was. And there was seemingly a consensus that said, I didn't want to be brought back. You know, it's just a shame. He wrote this book because in the 80s, I guess, instead of doing fake treadmill tests, they did real treadmill tests where people were literally on a treadmill, and as cardiologist, he had a lot of people die. And he had to resuscitate them. And he said, usually when they reported some kind of an experience, it was the same bright light, it was wonderful. But the thing that he started documenting, because it happened so often, was some of the patients really did seem peaceful, and when they brought them back, you know, the whole bright light thing. Other ones were scared to death, saying terrible things like they were in hell or that kind of an experience. But then after the fact, oh yeah, it was bright light, it was wonderful. So that's all they remembered. It was kind of like, you know what, this is kind of fishy here. Everybody's saying this, but he actually saw something different. I don't put any weight on that at all. All I'm trying to say is there's a bunch of confusion in that. The fact that it happens, I think, is proof that there's more than the physical realm. But what can be learned? I think there's some good caution here being expressed by the Apostle Paul. There's some of these things, he says, not permitted to tell, things that are inexpressible. But what we need to know, God has told us, and we've got that in His Word. One other thing I did want to comment on in the beginning of verse 4, I don't know what your translation says. Mine says caught up to paradise. Is that what yours says? Okay, this is a great word. It's the same word what Paul uses with the church at Thessalonica, talking about Christians being caught up in the air. But it's also, so the Apostle Paul is talking about whether he's in the body or out of the body, so I can't call it an out-of-body experience because he says, I don't know if I'm in the body or not. But obviously it's something unusual, right? Christians are talking about being caught up, but it's the same word used for Philip. Remember when this happened to Philip? After the Ethiopian eunuch? Remember this? I love this because when Seth was talking about miraculous spiritual gifts, he kept mentioning the gift of transportation. And it's kind of like, you know what? That's true. There was this miracle that happened to Philip. He was with the eunuch and then he was no more. He was caught up. But he wasn't caught up to heaven. He was transported. Well, you know what? God can do things like that.
Tornado.
I think if I were the eunuch, I'd be like, yeah, this is a God thing. You know, extra credentials, extra evidence. Verse 5, I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself, except about my weakness. He went into great detail about his weakness. Doesn't like to go into great detail about these special things. Why in the world would he bring stuff up like this? Well, it's true, but probably because of some of the false things that have been said about him. So sometimes you have to bring up, here's the truth. Here's the real Apostle Paul. Verse 6, even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would, here's where he says it. I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain. So no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say. I love this. I think Paul's reluctance, and especially talking about this experience he had, is because he doesn't want people putting him on a pedestal. It's all about bringing people to Jesus. If Mario was here, I don't see Mario. Mario and I know this guy who used to preach in Ohio, and he had a TV show. And always, you know, the first couple times I saw him on TV, this has been years ago, I thought, and the more I listened to him, the less I liked what he said. You know, neither here nor there. But the reason I mention this, at the end of his show, you know, I don't know how many times I saw it before I saw the whole thing. But the end of the show, he's dressed in a white suit and he's standing kind of profile like this so the camera can get him. And there's clouds in the background. Did I already tell you this? As the camera pulls away, he's standing on a pillar. He's standing on a pillar in the clouds. And I'm like, what are you doing? If that's not, you know, literally putting yourself on on a pillar. I think that's actually a warning that maybe
Looking
people
for
should
more money, that's all.
say what?
Just looking for more money.
I guess.
Send the money, please.
Yeah. Sadly, that's often what it is reduced to. Okay, to keep me from being from becoming conceited because of these surpassing great revelations, there was given to me. Now I know he could be making general reference, but it makes sense that what he just said is one of the things that he's talking about, right? So it's probably all these things. He says to keep me from becoming conceited, there was given to me a thorn in my flesh. Okay, I don't know if you care to know about this or not. This is good translation. Probably means thorn, but the word originally meant stake. And I just like that because we're not just talking about ouch. We're talking about debilitating kind of stuff. This is probably something pretty severe. Okay, what is it? I don't know. There have been so many different suggestions. I am partial to, if you heard discussions about this, I'm partial to the eyesight thing. I'm partial to the eyesight thing. Because there's several places where he said, which church does he say? That if you could have poked out your own eyes and given them to me. Which church was that?
I don't remember.
Thank you. He says it's church in Galatia. You know, if you would have been able to give me your eyes, you would have done that. And then he makes these comments about, see, I signed this with my own hand. See what large letters. I signed this. So, but I don't want to get distracted on that. It could have been a lot of different things. But Paul had a physical issue. Can I just get back to this, though? What I brought up earlier? What kind of things did the Apostle Paul pray for? When he asked for people to pray for him while he's in prison, for example, did he ever ask to get out of prison?
Nope.
Did he pray for them to get? No. What did he pray for while he was in prison? Do you remember this?
Opportunity to spread the gospel.
Opportunities and boldness. Make me bold. Don't get me out of here. This makes me think of this. I don't know if you've read this before or not, and now that I say this, I can't remember the guy's name. There was a missionary in South America who was working in Colombia, I believe. But anyway, he was kidnapped by communist guerrillas and just went through all sorts of severe things. But interviewed after the fact, somebody was asking him about, did you try to escape when he was held captive? And he was like, escape? Why? That never even entered his mind. His thought was, while he was working with the Indians in Colombia, he was a missionary to them. Once he was kidnapped by the guerrillas, well, I'm a missionary to these guys now. And that was just his attitude. And I find that so Paul-like. Because Paul is kind of like, it's not his personal comfort. Okay, let's get back to this. I don't want to miss this. He said there's some sort of physical problem, was a thorn in my flesh. What does he call it? A messenger of what?
Satan.
Okay, it's a messenger of Satan to torment me. Why? Let me read a couple more verses. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. Excuse me, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I just love this passage, and there's so many implications of this. But let's go back up to this. Why was Paul given this thorn in the flesh? What is his stated reason there at the very beginning? So that he wouldn't what?
Boast.
So he wouldn't what?
Be conceited, boast.
But yeah, become conceited. So the focus wouldn't be on himself or thinking too much about himself. So he could keep the focus. You know what? That's almost one of the answers to prayers that the Apostle Paul talks about praying for. That he might look at the opportunities, he might have boldness so he wouldn't get sidetracked, right? But if this comes from God, then how can it be a messenger of who?
The same way Satan caused David to number the people.
Oh!
People in a consensus.
Okay, David's a good example. I was thinking of Job. Was God involved in allowing Satan to attack Job? Of course he was. He's the one who put the limits on him.
He said he couldn't touch him.
Couldn't touch him. And then later he said, well, you can touch him, but you just can't kill him. Yeah, right, right. It's as, I don't know if this picture works for you or not, but it's as though you've got this dog that wants to kill you, but he's on a chain. But God lets out the chain a little bit. So Satan's the one doing some of these things, but you know what? God's ultimately in control. So he can say, yeah, God allowed it. In the same breath, he could say, this is the kind of thing from Satan. But you know what? God will put constraints. In fact, I always think of that 1 Corinthians 10:13 as far as temptation is concerned. God will not allow Satan to do what as far as temptation is concerned?
Tempt you beyond what you can bear.
Yeah, go beyond your limit. Go beyond your limit, which makes me think of the statement I've always liked. Most of us overestimate our ability to handle temptation and underestimate our ability to handle suffering. So when things get rough, it's kind of like, okay, God, I've had enough, you know. But as far as, oh yeah, reading that book, watching that show, that won't bother me. I can handle that, God, right? Okay. Here's the point I want us to chew on, though, for just a second here. With all that Paul talks about, can I present it this way? If we were, as Americans, going to respond to what's going on in North Korea, and so we send some aircraft carriers, we send massive, we flex American muscle, right? Why? Because of the atrocities that are taking place there, and I hope you know it's happening to a lot of Christians in North Korea. It's a terrible thing. There's a lot of reasons why America might do that, and by the way, I would pray for that. But let's say America decides to flex their muscle, and so we're making our presence known, and let's say we're in the middle of, we get rid of his nukes, we're starting to take down Kim Jong, whatever his name is, right? You know what I'm talking about. In the middle of that, and we interview, one of our guys, by the way, in church is on an aircraft carrier. And let's just say we interview somebody and say, well, how's the fight going? And the soldier tells us, oh, you know what, the food's not very good. And my cot is, I just can't get a good night's sleep. You know, he starts talking about stuff like that. What would we think? Yeah, you're a soldier. Come on, stop being a wimp. Maybe you think that, but
He can't tell you.
that has nothing to do with the game plan here. What's the game plan here? Let's take down the dictatorship that's doing evil, right? I know this sounds kind of weird, but isn't that what some Christianity has been reduced to? What do we pray about?
Keep me safe.
Seriously, if
Travel
one of the reasons we stopped having a prayer list,
Keep up Bill's
publicizing prayer lists, and a lot of churches have done this, is because you know what they usually turn into? Sick lists. Does God want all sick people well?
Sick
The
example
guy on
where he
TV
doesn't.
says so.
Do you understand why from this passage isn't our goal here to win a spiritual battle? You know what we're supposed to be praying about? Is the kind of car I drive while I go witness, does that make any difference at all? Okay, I'm beating a dead horse here. You already get the point, right? Was there a comment, or you just...
Yeah, I just was thinking on the messenger of Satan thing, and
Yes.
it's, you know, it's again the same act of you know, feeling a need, feeling a weakness. Satan is trying to get him to focus on himself and his weakness, and God is trying to get him to focus on him and his strength. So it's the same act, just from, you know, looking at it from
Thank you.
both sides of the same coin.
Yeah, and you guys can probably come up with several examples of this, but recently, in the last few weeks, I've had a couple of conversations, and I don't want to divulge anything I shouldn't, but I've heard people say, you know, I trusted God, and look what happened. And what they meant was, life got difficult. And what I tried to point out is, great,
Amen.
right? Because what we're here for is to win a war. It's not to have better meals or a softer cot on the aircraft carrier. I don't know if that illustration works or not. Verse 11, I've made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I am not in the least inferior to the super apostles. By the way, word of caution, I don't think there's other apostles criticizing him. I think the people who are criticizing him are comparing him to the other apostles. And where would you turn to in the New Testament if you want to defend Paul's apostleship? I know it's all the way through his writings, but there's a classic passage that you go to if you want to hear the Apostle Paul say, you want to know what an apostle is? I'm an apostle. Where would that be? Be the beginning of the book of Galatians.
That's his first one.
Galatians chapter 1 and on into chapter 2. Because he talks about, listen, I was trained in a different way, but just like the other apostles of Jesus, they were trained for how long? 3.5 years? What happened to the Apostle Paul? After his conversion, where did he
Out in the
go?
desert for 3.5 years.
Arabia to be trained by Jesus. So same kind of learning. Where do we learn that? We learn that at the beginning of Galatians chapter 1 and chapter 2. When he goes back to Jerusalem, he only meets with the other apostles briefly, but he also talks about when Peter came and he was with the Gentiles, but the Jews showed up, and Peter fell back into his old habits. What did Paul do?
Rebuke him
Yeah, can I say it this way?
to his face.
He had the nerve to call down the Pope. I'm being facetious here. Yeah. Why does he bring that up in the book of Galatians? Because he's making the point. Hey, these guys aren't apostles level 1 and Paul's an apostle level 2. Nope. If need be, if he needs to call down those guys, he's going to call down those guys. And he has the right to as a fellow apostle. Okay, so he's not the least bit inferior to quote-unquote super apostles, even though I am nothing. I love this. Remember how he talks about this before, about we apostles, not just him specifically, but we apostles. It's as though we're the last ones brought out at the tail of the procession. It's kind of like the captives of war to be made a spectacle of. He says that's us. So does life get hard? Yeah. Even though I'm nothing. Verse 12. The things that mark an apostle. Here you go. We're going to end on this. Signs, wonders, and miracles were done among you with great perseverance. These things, if you had to say one church in the New Testament was probably more focused on miraculous signs than any other church, what church would it be? Corinth. Yeah, remember in 1 Corinthians, all the chapters he spends talking about the miraculous gifts and the abuse thereof. How did people receive these miraculous gifts in the church? What we know is the laying on of the apostles' hands. Get that in Acts, the 8th chapter. So they're receiving these gifts through the apostle Paul, but they also saw many examples of his power. The 3 words that are used here when he talks about signs, wonders, and miracles. Do you have different words for those? Signs, wonders, especially the last one. Signs, wonders, and what?
Mighty works.
Okay, some will say miracles, some will say what?
Mighty works.
Mighty works, that's a good translation too. The idea, what does a sign do? Why do we put a sign out in front of the building? Why do we do that?
Points to something else.
Yeah, to inform the point. Here, turn here. It gets you going in the right direction. The wonder would be awe-inspiring. It doesn't do any good if it doesn't capture the attention, and sometimes that's exactly what needs to take place. So it points to something, it catches attention, and it displays God's power. And he says that's part of what's involved in being an apostle of Jesus. Capital A, little a, I know it's all capital letters when it's originally written, but what we mean by that, there are the apostles. How many apostles, what does the word apostle mean? One sent.
Yeah.
How many apostles of Jesus were there?
13 if you count Paul.
Thank you. Yeah. It's always a trick question. It's 12. It goes down to 11. They go back up to 12. Who's number 12 the second time?
Matthias.
Yeah, Judas is gone. Matthias comes in. And then the Apostle Paul, exact same level as the 12, but he makes number 13. There are 12 or 13, I can't forget now. There are 12 or 13 other apostles mentioned in the New Testament, but they are not apostles of Jesus. They're apostles of the church. Barnabas would be one
yeah.
example of that. But there are at least
Mark.
a dozen others that have the same designation.
They even
Any
named some
questions,
women.
comments? Let's pray.
Good, yeah.
Gracious Heavenly